we can perform mathematical operations on our numeric variables. Here I have declared a float a, which has a value of 3, and integer b, which has a value of 4. We can use debug.log here to display the results. So I can say a minus 1, for example, and a has a value of 3. If I go back here in the console and I have my script attached to the camera, if I run this, we see that 2 is displayed in our console. I can do the same thing here for my integer, so I can say b minus 1 and b is 4, so 4 minus 1 equals 3. If I run the program, we see that 3 is displayed in the console. We can also use this to write expressions. So if I go back here, we can assign a value. So you can say, for example, float c is equal to a minus 1 and end the statement. And here in debug.log, I will just, display c. If I go back here and if I run the game, we will see that 2 is displayed in the console. So basically what we did here is we took one variable which we already declared, subtracted 1 from it, and assigned it directly to a new variable. We can do this also with an integer and a float, but we need to use casting. So for example, if we use int, let's see, e is equal to, for example, b plus a, and just end the statement now. If I go back here, we will see that, we have an error. It says, cannot implicitly convert type float to an integer. Are you missing a cast? And how do we do that, and what does cast mean? Well, basically, we can just write here in these parentheses in front of this a variable, which represents a float. So we can say int, and this will convert our float, which has a value of 3. It will automatically convert it into an integer. And here we can, debug.log output this new integer. If I go back here, we will see that error will go away. And now, if I run the program, we will see that 7 is displayed in the console. And we can use casting the same way we did for our integer. We can use it for our float. Just instead of writing int, we can use float. And now we will take a look at functions. If we want to use a group of code over and over again, we can group that code into a function, and that will make it easier for us to use that code. We have 4 types of functions. We have a function that does not take a parameter and does not return a value. We have a function that takes a parameter but does not return a value. We have a function that returns a value but does not take a parameter. And lastly, we have a function that takes a parameter and also returns a value. Now let us write a simple function that does not take a parameter and does not return a value. So here I'll just give a little bit space. And how do we declare a function that does not return any value? Well, we type void, and this means that a function will not return any value. And now we need to give a name to this function. Same as with variables, we need to give meaningful names so that we can remember for what we want to use, this function. So for this one, I will just say print, add these parentheses and these, curly brackets, and this is how we declare a function. Now, everything that we type between these, curly brackets is the code that will be executed when we call this function. Now we can take all of this code here that we wrote and we can pass it here, and I can just remove this code here and we can call this function. And we call the function by using its name and adding these parentheses like this. If I run the program, go back here into Unity, clear the console, and if I run the program, we will see that 7 is outputted again in the console, because here we are outputting, our variable e, which we are getting when we, add, a to our b variable. Now let us see how can we declare a function that takes a parameter. Well, simply here between these parentheses, we can type a parameter. And a parameter can be any variable, so it can be a float, it can be an integer, it can be a string, a boolean, even an object. And don't worry about objects, we will take a look at them a little bit later. So for example here I can just say string message, and this will be our parameter. So instead of typing all of this to debug.log, I can just print out the message. But now when I call this function, I need to pass, a parameter to that function. In our case, a string. If we don't do that, if I go here, Unity will complain because, the method or the function print takes an argument and we did not give it that argument. So here we need to pass a string. So let's say print something. like this. If I now go back here, I will clear the console, and when I run the program, we will see that print something is printed out in the console because we specified here when we call the function, and that's this parameter here, which will, well, debug.log use to output in the console. Now let us declare a function that returns a value. Same as with parameters, the value that a function can return can be of any type. It can be a float, an integer, a boolean, so on and so forth. So here, instead of, well, passing a parameter, we will return it. So I will just erase this here, and instead of void, we will type the type of a value that we want to return. In our case, we want to return a string. If that's an integer, we will type integer, and so on and so forth. In a function that returns a value, we need a return statement. So we type return, and now we type, well, a variable that we want to return. So for example, we want to return the same thing, print something here. And now we cannot call our function with a parameter because it does not take a parameter, and we will erase this here, and we will not call this function like this because excuse me, it returns something. So we can say debug.log like this. Let me just erase this. We can say debug.log, and we can pass this function as a parameter in our debug.log because it will return print something. If I go back here in Unity, I will clear the console, excuse me. If I run the program, we will see that print something has been printed out in the console. We can also assign this directly to a variable. So here we can say, for example, string message is equal to, and we can say print like this, and we assign this, well, print something directly to our message or our string. If I, well, delete this here and pass message, and I go back into Unity here, I will clear the console. If I run the program, we see again that print something has been printed in the console because now our string message here contains this value here. Lastly, we have a function that also returns a value and takes a parameter. First of all, there is no limit to the number of parameters that we can pass to a function. So I'll just erase this here, and in our case we will return an integer. And here I will type two parameters. I will say int a, comma, int b, and this is how we pass multiple parameters. So we can pass one parameter, 2, 4, 3, even of different type. So we can say here comma string c like this, and we can pass all of these parameters to our function. And now I will calculate these two and return a third number. So I will just remove this here. So I will just quickly remove it. And now what we can do, we can say, for example, a plus b like this, and we can say return, or we can create a third variable. So we can say int c is equal to a plus b and then return c. But this, well, down here that I wrote is way quicker. So now what we can do is we can call our function. So we can say here print, and we can pass two parameters. So let's say, for example, 5, comma 6. And in the same way, I need to erase this here, and the same way that we, well, declare our parameters, the same way we pass them. So we say 5, comma, and then 6. So this is the first parameter, this is the second parameter, and this will return 11 because 5 plus 6 is 11. If I go back here into Unity, I will clear the console, and if I run the program, we will see that 11 has been printed out in the console.